What I'd like to do in the last part is to kind of draw some conclusions that will be more familiar to you. First of all, I want to begin with a rather heavy document that I've already mentioned before, so I can be short with it. But it is the Pontifical Biblical Commission on Jewish and Christian Interpretation of the Scriptures, in a document called The Jewish People and Their Sacred Scriptures in the Christian Bible. It came out in 2002. The Pontifical Biblical Commission was founded in the very earliest part of the 20th century, and at first consisted of non-biblical scholars, mostly cardinals and so on. And then in Paul VI reformed it in the 1960s by making it consist of biblical scholars from all over the world, professionals and high-quality people. And they have produced a series of short pieces or of pamphlets. One on the truth of the Gospels was one that was well received. Another was in the 1990s on the Christian interpretation of the Bible. And then one came out in 2002 on the Scriptures. And what it did, it said it gave a lot of information about Judaism and about Jews in the Bible. But one of the things it said was this, and I wanted to let you look at it because I've already mentioned the conclusion, but let me just, first of all, it says in number 22 of this document, it was put out by the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith under then Cardinal Ratzinger. It says this: as regards Christians reading the Scriptures in their own way, Christians can and ought to admit that the Jewish reading of the Bible is a possible one. In continuity with the Jewish sacred Scriptures from the Second Temple period, a reading analogous to or similar to the Christian reading which developed in parallel fashion. In other words, it's saying something like this: we Christians believe that what we are interpreting when we interpret the Old Testament or the Scriptures is legitimate. Why? Because you can find it already in the ancient Scriptures themselves, okay? Daniel particularly, but also Zechariah, and then tendencies and thrusts in other parts of the Bible, including the regular prophets. Just as they make that claim for themselves, they make an equal claim for the legitimacy of the Jewish reading, because what Judaism, especially in its early formative phases, if you want to call it formative Judaism or rabbinic Judaism, did the same. They noticed and took what they considered to be central, and they made it the staple of their of their religious life and beliefs. And so there's a kind of legitimating on both sides. And I think it's well reasoned, because if you say that what Jews believed, especially in that formative period, rabbinic Judaism, it's already in the Bible that Christians have accepted, they have to say, well, it's legitimate. They say possible, but I think you cannot substitute the term legitimate. They're not saying that I want to become a Jew, and Jews are not saying I want to become a Christian. It just says that both of the Judaism and Christianity are invited to look upon the use made of the ancient Scriptures as legitimate for them. Doesn't mean it's what I believe. It means it's a legitimate reading because it's found. Here's the corresponding thing. I think I've given you the gist of it. We don't need to pay. But number 22 and number 64, if you're interested in that document, the two ones that I think are particularly significant. So let's go now to the cross-references, which I mentioned in the Old Testament, within the Old Testament. Now I come to some cross-references between the Testaments. And notice that I won't be using the conventional ones that I mentioned at the beginning, like Paul in 1 Corinthians 10 saying that the crossing of the Red Sea is a type of baptism, because you go through the Red Sea and you emerge from it as freed and as liberated and able to worship the Lord alone. So also, and then that kind of thing. That's rather familiar. But I wanted to point out my little friend. This is a lion, in case you didn't recognize. He does look like he has human features, but why in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 1, God appears to the prophet in a chariot that is carried by 4 animals. One of the animals has a human face, so one is a human being. Another is a lion. Another is a ox, and another is a eagle. And so in Christian tradition, especially since Jerome, at first they had different, everybody saw something different. So, I think John was a lion, but they finally got it sort of settled by the time of St. Jerome in 400. And then in the Middle Ages particularly, this was important. But I just put it in because I think that Christian symbols, we tend to neglect them. And if you go to a cathedral in the Middle Ages, you'll find loads of symbols. And you'll also find in the Middle Ages, in some of those cathedrals, you'll find a beautiful view of aspects of the Old Testament there. You'll find people really paid attention, and even though they might not have been literate, they knew what was up in the Bible in a way that many modern people who are literate don't know. So I just put them, now why would Mark be? Well, Mark begins with John the Baptist preaching in the wilderness. And where do lions live, especially in that world? They live in the wilderness, because they did have lions in Israel up until, I think up until the 12th or 13th, 14th century. And some of them were down in the Jordan Valley, so where John preached. So they begin with this lion, and a lion symbolizes aggressive views and great commitments and so on. And so here's Mark and the lion. But here's how some aspects in which the Old Testament is influenced this. Well, Mark is about between 67 and 70. They put him, Mark, in talking about the destruction of the temple that is predicted, doesn't seem to present the destruction of the temple as actually having happened at the time of the composition. So people want to put him around a little before the temple destruction in 70. That's only a guess. But Mark he's sometimes called the Cinderella Gospel, because Mark was kind of dismissed in the Middle Ages. Matthew was the go-to gospel. Everybody thought Matthew was the one that had the most influence upon Christian life. But in recent decades, people once dismissed Mark as kind of simple and untutored, and Jesus gets mad. That's kind of, Matthew would never have angry Jesus, but he would. But in the course of study of Mark again and again in the last few decades, people have come to see that Mark is a very theological gospel. And he's as theological as anybody else. He's sometimes called the Cinderella Gospel. He came late to the party, so to speak. But he's profoundly theological, and part of it is because we now know a little bit more about the way he used symbols and concepts. And this is one thing that he used. Mark uses the word hodos, which in Greek means path, or road, or journey. And he uses it a number of times in a theological way. That is to say, in a way that's not simply saying we took the road to Jerusalem or we took the road here. He uses it in a kind of symbolic, theological way, and I'll just point out a couple of ways that he does. But you have to know the Old Testament, and in using it, Mark is really referring back to the Old Testament. He's cross-referencing, and what he's saying is, by doing this, he's saying, look, I'm going to show that what you read in the Old Testament actually has a kind of trajectory, a kind of afterlife that shows up in the Gospel of Mark, and therefore it legitimates the Gospel of Mark as an authentic interpretation of the ancient scriptures. And so we find in the Bible, in the Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures, we find the way of the Lord. And we find it particularly in Isaiah chapter 40, which is the great inaugural version, comfort ye my people, make straight in the wilderness a pathway for our Lord. And what that means is that God is telling his messengers, his angelic servants, to make a road through the wilderness where the people can leave their place of bondage, their place of exile, and return home to the land that they really ought to be in anyway. That is the Holy Land of God, to come back and to do that. So that's in the Bible. It's not only in Exodus, but it's not only in the book of Isaiah chapter 40, but it is there in a most preeminent way. And that particular text triggered the imagination of early Christian thinkers. So they kept coming back to it. So Mark does too. But there's also the story in Mark, in the Old Testament, of the Lord coming to the holy city of Jerusalem in order to be enthroned as king and to be worshipped as such by the people as he enters his temple, his own house, in triumph. And there the people will celebrate his kingship. So that's another use of the term path or way in the Old Testament. And Mark is going to take up both of them. So for the Gospel of Mark, He uses the term way, a path, a lot. And people, first of all, said, oh, it doesn't mean much. But then as they looked more carefully at Mark, they say, it means a lot. It means that he is assuming that you know what he's talking about. And this is how he works. So it's God's way through the wilderness. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples. So if you look at some significant occurrences in the Gospel of Mark of this term, the Greek term hodos, which means way, but it's translated as pathway or journey or whatever, and it's translated sometimes not as way, but as road or path. It's not simply a flat use of it as if this is the road to Jerusalem, this is the road to such and such. It's the Lord's way which we are invited to follow. Okay, so the Lord is going to his temple, and as you know in the Gospels, the journey to Jerusalem is a big deal. In fact, Luke later on is going to take the references to journey to Jerusalem in Mark, because Mark is one of the sources of the Gospel of Luke. He's going to take that and he's going to blow that journey up to 10 chapters. Because for Mark, a lot of stuff happens as Jesus is headed to Jerusalem, because Luke knows that in Jerusalem it's got to happen. The king should be accepted and enthroned in the temple so that all people recognize his glory. Instead, what's going to happen in Jerusalem? He is going to be killed. But paradoxically, his death will lead to his enthronement and the resurrection. That's how the Gospel of Luke sees it. So in Luke, he takes something that's rather modest in Mark, one of his sources, and blows it up into something big. Okay, so let's go back to Mark and stay. And I wanted to use something that I think is to me, an exceptional understanding and use of the term road or path in Mark's Gospel. And I'm going to do it. I'm going to read something that you can read. I'm going to read it, but you can see it. But I wanted this is a particular story about the blind Bartimaeus in chapter 10 of Mark. And it is a long passage that talks about the healing of a blind man. And normally it's a little longer than Mark's normal healings. So it's a sign that Mark thinks this is a big deal. It goes this way. They came to Jericho, and as he was leaving Jericho with his disciples and a sizable crowd, Bartimaeus, a blind man, the son of Timaeus, sat by the road begging. Okay, how is he? He's not on the road. He's on the side of the road. And he's there begging and he can't see. Okay, so Mark is not a fool. He's not just giving you a chronicle. He knows what he's doing with words. So here is this man, can't see, he can hear, he knows a lot of things are happening, the crowd he feels, the excitement, but he's not on the road. He's sitting there and he is overlooked. On hearing that it was Jesus of Nazareth, notice he can't see, he's got to hear it, he yells out, Jesus, son of David, have pity on me. And many rebuked him. They tell him to keep quiet. Many rebuked him, telling him to be silent. But he kept calling out all the more, Son of David, have pity on me. So Jesus stops in his tracks, and he says, call him. Suddenly the crowd, realizing that Jesus is coming, they suddenly change too. They don't tell him to keep quiet anymore. So they call the blind man, saying to him, take courage, get up, he is calling you. So he threw aside his cloak. Now the cloak was the way blind people made their living, because they sat on the side of the road and they expected you to throw the money into the cloak, which they kept, they make sure they're not going to throw it to the dirt with somebody else. They kept it in the cloak, and then they would pull it toward themselves, because it was basically their one item of business, their one business thing. So the cloak is big. So he threw aside his cloak, okay? So that's more than he senses something big is going to happen. And he's no longer going to, somehow, he has a intuition maybe, or a hope, that his life of beggary is not going to continue to his death. So he throws aside his cloak, he springs up, always a risky thing for a blind person to get up fast. You don't know what you're going to bump into. And he came to Jesus, and Jesus said to him, what do you want me to do for you? As if that were pretty obvious. So he said, the blind man replied, Master, I want to see. So he's got one thing on his mind. Then what else would he have on his mind? Jesus told him, go your way, your faith has saved you. Immediately he received his sight and followed him on the way. You see what it is? He gets on the road and he can follow Jesus to Jerusalem. And so that's really the kind of subtlety that people were not getting a little bit, because they thought that Mark was simply naive and simply a chronicler. But they didn't recognize that Mark could use a simple story to communicate a very profound truth. And so in this little drama, if you don't know what road means, you miss half of it. And so that's an indication of how Mark is both simple and profound at the same time, but he expects a lot of the reader. The reader has to know the Bible enough or you don't get it. Okay, we finished with the lion. Now, what new animal will we pick up in a moment? Okay, there's something more to come. This is Matthew. Matthew is represented by the one like a human with a human face in Ezekiel chapter 1, but also it's alluded to in the book of Revelation chapter 4. And sometimes the man is presented with wings, so the man, quotes the man, human being, is an angel. But why? Because Matthew gives us a genealogy in which traces things back to Abraham. Matthew stresses the incarnation of Jesus as a human being, and that sort of thing. I mean, it's clear that this is a symbol that you've got to work a little bit to get at the truth of. Okay, let's see what about Matthew. All right, Matthew and Luke are about 85. So you have Mark about 70. You know, Jesus dies in 30. A long silence. The first Christian document that we have is 51, so 21 years until you get to something written that's been preserved. Before that time, you have oral, circulation of oral material and so on. And then in the 80s, you have two people writing about the middle of the 80s who draw on Mark as one of their sources. Both Matthew and Luke draw on Mark, but they also draw on their own sources as well. So Matthew is a little embarrassed by some of Mark's enthusiasms. Jesus is no longer angry in the Gospel of Matthew. I hope Mark wasn't still alive, that he could see himself being corrected. Matthew, though, reflects some of the conflict between Judaism and Christianity. And unfortunately, some of the anti-Judaism, and like Matthew 23, about the Pharisees, which was the way when Jews had an argument in that early period, you can see it in the Qumran scrolls, they just went after each other with language like spouter of lies, king of deceit. They just yelled at each other. Unfortunately, that stuff gets preserved to another generation that doesn't understand the polemical and fraternal conflict and begins to use it to absolutely as a typing of Jews that is most unfortunate. But Matthew has to be carefully, that particular chapter and a few other places have to be carefully explained. So this was a period with formative Judaism. And I mentioned before that after 70, the Judaisms, plural, begin to become Judaism, singular. And you can see why. They've suffered a tremendous trauma. And when you suffer a trauma, you're not so open to everything under the sun anymore. You're trying to recoup and to get a sense of yourself, oftentimes by constricting and defining more clearly than you did before the trauma happened. So Judaism has suffered a tremendous trauma, and in the doing of it, there's a lot of conflict with what seems to many Jews to be the authentic Judaism, that is to say Christianity. The majority of Jews say, no way, this is not Judaism. This is something else. We don't accept it. So you have then a conflict in very earliest Jewish Christianity with Judaism. And so you're going to see Matthew is trying to enter this controversy, and what he wants to do is present Jesus as the embodiment of Torah. If you really understand Jesus, you will see that he is profoundly appreciative and interpretive of the Torah that gives us life. And so he's in there to help you. So his genealogy, which talks about, it aligns Jesus with Exodus, the death of the innocent. Pharaoh kills the boys in Exodus chapter 1. Jesus, in the case of Jesus, there's another similar killing of boys. What he wants to do is say, look, this guy's life aligns with the formative moment of our identity as the people of God back in Exodus. And can't you see that? Can't you see that this is not inimical to authentic Judaism? Well, it's obvious that it didn't convince the main group, but it does help us to understand the roots, the Jewish roots of our world. So he connects it to the story of Israel, and then finally, the final commission, make disciples of all nations, connects Jesus especially to the church. But notice what he says. He doesn't say convert them. He says make disciples. This is what rabbis want to do. When a rabbi, they want to make disciples. So he's not telling you, convert them, baptize them, and that's all right. He's saying, make disciples. Go out there like a good rabbi and say, would you like to be my disciple and I can teach you about the Torah and what it really means for daily life? So you can see that there's a heavily Jewish component in Jesus because he's trying to stress, and yet at the same time you sense there's a lot of conflict, especially when the condemnation of the Pharisees in chapter 23. That's a very painful time, and heavy things are said against them that unfortunately are going to be misunderstood by later generations of Christians. So what happens? So it's composed, as I say, in the heat of rivalry. Judaism, they're rejecting him as Messiah. So Matthew portrays Jesus as the fulfillment of Torah. Everything was predicted. You keep fulfill, goes all the way through. He says, if you really understand your scriptures, you'll know all of this stuff, these promises are coming true in this particular man. He's the messianic interpreter of Torah. He teaches on a mountain. Moses teaches on a mountain. They go up on the mountain. And what Jesus does is take the Torah and tries to deepen it and make it more applicable. So he doesn't quote other rabbis. Notice he's not quoting other rabbis. It normally would be Rabbi so-and-so said this. He doesn't say that. He says, I say. But he says, for example, thou shalt not murder. Okay, that doesn't have much relevance to most people's lives. Most of us are not murderers. So what he tries to do is to show that thou shalt not kill is actually has implications for your daily life, because it means he wants to make it apply to resentments and to uncharitable talk, which most of us, unfortunately, are addicted to or prone to anyway. And he wants to make it applicable, so he's trying to extend it, because that's what a good teacher does. He's not trying to do away with it, he's trying to extend it, and uses, obviously, the usual things of exaggeration and focal instances and so on to make it really hit home and make it memorable. Okay, what else does he do? He's almost a personification of Torah, because he's eternal. I mean, the sense of Torah was eternal. Torah was always in the mind of God. And he says, and then the study of Torah is that righteous is offering sacrifice in the temple. And so he says, to be really Jewish, take on the yoke of the law. And he says, the yoke, make it, if you really want to do it, take it on and you'll find it's much easier than you think. It'll be sweet. And so his disciples, the disciples and Mark are stupid because they don't get it. Because Mark wants you to realize that Jesus just, it's not easy to understand Jesus. And so I wouldn't want to be a disciple of anybody if Mark was the person who's going to write up the report. But in Matthew, the disciples are intelligent because they're scribes. They're scribes in the kingdom. And so they get it. And they may not get everything, but they get most of it, because they are scribes that are instructed by the great rabbi, the great teacher. And so they're intelligent. They assume the role of scribes in the rival Pharisaic form of Judaism, because scribes are honored in the Pharisaic tradition and in Judaism generally. So they had to make disciples of other people as well. So there's a lot of, I wouldn't mind having my biography written by Matthew. All right, now we come to Luke. Now Luke would be about 85 as well. So Luke's in the middle. By this time, I should have said already that Mark, one of the things that people now understand about Mark, to give a little background to Luke and Matthew, is that Mark was the one who really invented the genre of gospel, it seems. Because as we know before, first of all, you have the deeds and the words of Jesus, and then these are put into memorable forms that were partly oral. And they would be used by Christian preachers and instructors to go around and to instruct Christian communities about what Jesus said and did. And so they begin to take shape. They begin to be formed by these catchword principles. The word salt things that have to do with salt would be put together in a string of sayings. And they begin to take some kind of shape. But but Mark seems to be the first one, or at least among the first, to invent the gospel and to use the word evangelize, to the good news, to evangelize, which comes out of 2nd Isaiah as a term, to tell the good news. You begin with John the Baptist preaching, and you end with the resurrection. And then you organize your material in a variety of ways. Mark seems to have pioneered in this kind of thing. So at the end, you have a fixed gospel that's written down, that everybody agrees to, and they take care about making sure that it's transmitted and copied correctly. So when you come 15 years later, you get Matthew, and you get Luke. And they're the heirs of an already established genre, probably the one done by Mark, or maybe somebody just before Mark. But anyway, Mark deserves a lot of credit for shaping the style of what a gospel is. So when you come to these two people, they know what a gospel is. They're going to begin with the preaching of John, and they're going to end with the resurrection. But they're going to do a little bit more with the resurrection than Mark does. And they're also going to have an infancy narratives, both of them, because they are now beginning to see that there is need of a Christology. And one way to put a good Christology together is through narrative, not through essay, but through narrative. And one way to do that is to tell what happened before the public life. Do we have indications of what kind of person Jesus was prior to his public preaching? And so they both give us a narrative very heavily based upon the Old Testament that helps us understand Jesus' rootedness in the Old Testament, the ancient scriptures, but also give indications of what's going to happen to Jesus in the course of his life. He expands, as I mentioned before, he expands Mark's journey to Jerusalem into 10 chapters. So that's a big deal, because for him, it really is that place, it's in Jerusalem where the whole thing happens, and you want to set it up to be significant by making the journey lengthy and including a variety of episodes. This is something that I've figured out on myself, even though I'm not primarily a New Testament scholar, so I put it in, even if you don't like it, it's there. So it's a way of describing how they use the Old Testament. And I would like to just simply say, you're probably not familiar with the beginning of the book of Samuel, but I'll just briefly sketch it. By the time that the book of Samuel, by the time of the events of the book of Samuel is recording, Israel has come into a huge crisis of leadership. They have had a series of 12 judges. These are they're kind of charismatic military leaders. Each one of them is designated to answer a particular crisis, but then when the crisis is over, they go back to their ordinary work. Israel at this point does not want a king because they're afraid of what a king might do. So here they are in crisis. The place is coming apart. There's all kinds of depravity that is being recorded. And you then go to the scene shifts to a woman, and to a woman who is unable to have a child. Again, you'd think that a big savior is going to come charging through. Instead, you go to a woman who is just an ordinary person, who unfortunately is unable to bear a child, and is very unhappy about that because she doesn't feel fulfilled as a woman in that culture. So she goes to the shrine, and she gets a promise from the priest that she will have a child. And she says that if I have a child, I'll donate the child to the sanctuary service because I am so grateful to have a child. So the child is born. His name is Samuel, and when she finds that she is pregnant, she sings the Magnificat in chapter 2. And the Magnificat is a praise of God, a glorying in the fact that she's now going to play a significant role in the governance of Israel, and at last God is going to make Israel a peaceful and well-governed nation. And the priesthood, however, was corrupt because Eli was an okay guy, but his two sons were completely corrupt. And so the priesthood wasn't going to be the means by which God would bring about some kind of good governance. So Samuel is born, little boy. He's sent to the sanctuary. He's Eli's servant, does very well there. And it says about him that he grew in stature and worth in the estimate of the Lord and the people. And then Samuel is finally the person that announces that Saul is going to be the king, and he anoints Saul. So he's the one that introduces monarchy, the Davidic Empire, the Davidic kingship, which is going to solve and heal Israel's governance problems. Okay, when you come to the beginning of Luke, in chapters 1 and 2, it's the infancy narratives. You tend to take it as, it's certainly not stories, it's not childhood pictures, like you go into somebody's house and they tell you, here's how Joe looked at when he was 6 years old, and that's not what they're doing. They're trying to understand who Jesus is by talking about his lineage and his relationship to the ancient scriptures. So you have they're occupied. It's an occupied power. The Romans are there. Nobody likes the way they're governing. And then Elizabeth has no child. She's the older woman. And Mary has no child. She's married, but she hasn't had any relations with her husband. So Mary then is told that she's going to have a child, and she utters a prayer, or a prayer of thanksgiving that is almost a carbon copy of the one that Hannah does, okay? So it's clear that something similar is happening now that happened before. And then the priest Zechariah, his response to the angel is inadequate, okay? So does that get you? The priest is not going to come from it. Somehow it seems okay to the reader, but from what happens, the fact that he's struck dumb for a period of time means that it wasn't very open, what he has. But Mary, of course, is completely open. And so the priest kind of falls down a little bit here. He's the father of John the Baptist. But Mary doesn't. And then it says twice, and Jesus advanced in wisdom and age and favor before God and men. So clearly a quote from what was said about the boy Samuel. And then finally, this boy is the Davidic king. He is the Davidic Messiah who will rule Israel in the future. Do you see how subtle that is? They're really telling a story that you got to pick up. You have to know something about the earlier story to really pick it up. It's a crisis that God solves, not by bringing in some gigantic warrior, but by going to a little girl. Why? Because God chooses the weak things of the world in order to do great things. Why? It makes God's glory all the brighter. And so the same thing is happening at two crisis points. And this is a typical way, I think, of the Gospels, the way they work. So that's just one example of Luke. You could go through many others, and I just wanted to point that out. And now, what animal are we about to see here? Well, there's only one left. The eagle. So you shouldn't be surprised. So, okay, John is compared to the eagle. Why? Because the eagle flies high, and the eagle is the only creature that can look directly into the sun without blinking. And John is flying high from the very beginning, that opening. So anyway, John flies high, favorite of mystics. So John was written about the mid-90s. That's the usual view, maybe a bit later, but about the mid-90s. He's no direct link to the other traditions. He's kind of it's not, the synoptics, it's called synoptics because you can put them in a row and they can be read synoptically, but not John. But he draws on similar traditions, however, and he makes explicit what is implicit in them. And he puts a lot of focus on Jesus rather than the kingdom. Now, there's two things that the Gospel of John does to interpret Jesus for us. John, first of all, makes Jesus into personified wisdom. He says, look, we know that in the Old Testament that wisdom is with God, and that it is a gift of God. And wisdom is with God, not God, but with God. And she, as a female figure, is given by God to people as a great gift. Makes them see clearly, it's a blessing, it makes them receive blessings, and so on. So what John does is to say this fantastic and beautiful wisdom that is with God, and was with God from the beginning, is Jesus. And so he draws on the passages that I am giving you there, and you can see what he's doing. As woman wisdom was with God from the beginning, even before there was an earth. That's said in Proverbs 8 and Sirach. So Christ is the Word in the beginning, with the Father before the world existed. John 17:5. So he's trying to explore, it's not so much now on the kingdom of God as it is on the way the kingdom is expressed in his community, which was the person of Jesus. And so you want to know as much as you can about this full instantiation of God's rule. He's standing right in front of you. But you got to penetrate what he is by seeing how he fulfills and completes what was promised in the past. Another one, as wisdom teaches, obviously Jesus teaches all the time, but also wisdom seeks people out. In the book of the Proverbs, wisdom says, wait at my door until I come out. So you're like a schoolboy or like a lover waiting at the door of his or her beloved until she comes out and says, okay, I want to be with you. So this is what Jesus does. He comes out, and remember, he searches out when he meets his disciples. It's kind of in chapter 1. He doesn't like he calls them. He goes out and says to one, okay, come here. And this kind of interactive thing. Then one gets another one. So he's kind of looking out for these people whom he eventually says, come home with me, and I'll show you more. And that's how wisdom operates, too. So it's a kind of personal relationship that owes a lot to the way wisdom seeks disciples, especially in Proverbs 8. And also, wisdom in Proverbs 8 particularly gives long instructions. Chapter 1 of Proverbs 8, Proverbs, and chapter 8 is a long instruction. She comes out, she goes in the middle of the town square, she starts shouting in the middle of the town square, and all these people come. Nobody is excluded. Little people, big people, kids, boys, adults, etc. They all come in to hear what she has to say, and that's what Jesus does. He goes out in the street and talks. He talks to anybody. And he even goes to the temple, and he calls them his children, and that's what wisdom calls her people too. And also wisdom tests her disciples, especially in Sarah, and says, I want to put you a little test here to make sure that you, first of all, are loyal, but also to teach you how to be a more mature personality. This is what Jesus seems to do, too. He trains the disciples. He just doesn't talk to them. He wants them to grow and become friends of God. Now, the other thing that Jesus does, and that the fourth gospel does, that owes a lot to the Old Testament, is what he does with the Feast of Passover. The Feast of Passover, of course, more or less corresponds in date to our Easter, and in fact, it has much to do with our Easter. It's fully told in Exodus 12 and 13, but it's also elsewhere in the Bible spoken of. He multiplies the loaves in chapter 6. And after he multiplies the loaves, which evoke Passover, he walks in the water, which is a kind of Passover, passing over the sea. So there's clearly an attempt to show a new depth to a Jewish feast that you Jews have celebrated for centuries. I'm going to show you that I belong in the middle of that celebration in a way that you might not have thought of. And I'm going to be the one who multiply the loaves, I'll be like Moses, multiplying loaves so that you have plenty of bread. And then I'm going to walk in the water. And just as your ancestors walked in the water and escaped from Egypt. Also, when Jesus speaks of himself as the bread of life, he contrasts it deliberately with manna that Moses gave. So in other words, he's saying, I'm there. If you know that thing and you believe, then come to me because you're going to find an abundance of what you had experienced with Moses. And then finally, Jesus places Jesus' death at the moment when lambs were slaughtered in preparation for the Passover meal. Now, in John, it's not a Passover meal, but he's sacrificed on the very moment when the Passover lambs were slaughtered. So he is the Lamb of God, as it's said expressly in chapter 19, and it's also in the beginning when he first calls the disciples, that one of them says, "You're the Lamb of God." So that gives you an example of how rich the Old Testament makes how it deepens the New Testament, and how it reminds us again that the New Testament did not begin it. I tell people, if you want to read a mystery story, do you begin in chapter 5? And they say, no, why don't you begin in chapter 1? And that's what we wanted to have you to do with the Old Testament. Begin in chapter 1. And chapter 5 will mean a lot more when you finally get to it. So anyway, thank you for your attention, and I hope that you enjoy it.